Lesson 5 focuses on decimal notation. So basically, how do we expand decimals? How do we state the meaning of a decimal? Also, how do we round decimals? Kind of sorting decimals from smallest to greatest. So just kind of looking at decimals and what do they actually mean. So the first thing is this chart here, um, where we have ones, thousands, millions, and billions on the left, separated by a decimal point when we get into our decimals. So just looking at this, ones meaning it's just one. Tens, we have 1 0. Hundreds, we have 2 0. Thousands, we have 3 zeros. Thousand, 10,000s, we have 4 zeros. So you can kind of see a pattern here of the zeros just increasing. When we're talking about 100,000s, now we're looking at 5 zeros, million 6, 10 million 7 zeros, 100 million, we have our 6 zeros for a million, and then we have the 100 in front of it. So altogether we have 8 zeros. Anytime you're talking about 1 million, so if you're looking at it, anytime we're talking about 1 million, we actually have our 6 zeros. And if you want to say 10 million, you have to keep your 6 zeros for the million, but then you put the 10 out in front. 100 million, you have your 6 zeros for a million, and then you put your 100 out in front. Same thing goes with billion. It's just now we have another set of 3 zeros. So now we have 9 zeros for a billion. So when we're looking at 10 billion or 100 billion, we're looking at have those 9 zeros, but then you have to have the 10 or 100 out in front. So whenever you have a billion, you have 9 zeros. Where 10 billion, you have your 9 zeros, and then you have that 10 out in front, which is why it's called 10 billion. 100 billion, you have your 9 zeros with the 100 out in front. Now, when we go to decimals, notice the pattern here. So the pattern, the zeros keep, you keep getting more and more zeros in front of the 1. But notice how many zeros and how it relates to the whole number. So tenths is 1 decimal place. The way to remember it easy, when you're thinking about tens, you have 1 0. Hundreds is 2 decimal places. How many zeros are in 100? There's 2. Thousands, there's 3 decimal places. There's 3 zeros in 1,000. 10,000, 4 zeros, or 4 decimal places, meaning we have 4 zeros. And you can kind of see the pattern would just keep on going. Okay, so that's kind of just a review of the different places for decimals. Let's actually go now and look at an example. So this first example here, we want to write 423.576 in expanded form and in words. I purposely didn't say in words because I want to talk about that in a minute. So first thing is in expanded form. So what that means is take each piece of this number and write it as a fraction in its appropriate place value. So when I'm looking at 4, this represents 400. So the first part is going to be 400. And then the next digit is 2, which represents the 10 value, in this case 20. And then we have 3 ones. Plus, now we get into our decimals. So this 5 is in the tens position, which means it's really the same thing as saying 5 over 10. Because it's in the tens position. Also because if I said 5 divided by 10, you would get your 0.5. The 7 is in the hundreds position, so it's going to be 7 over 100. And the 6 is in the thousands position. 3 zeros, 3 decimal places, 3 zeros. So we do 6 over 1,000. So that is 423.576 in expanded form. The next piece is in words. So after having an expanded form, it kind of helps you come up with in words. So we have 423 and 576 thousandths. My decimal place here for the 6 is in the thousandth position. So that means when we end our statement, we're going to say thousands. And the real reason for that is because if I were to take all of these decimals here at the end, the 5/10, if I want to write that in terms of 1,000, like with a denominator of 1,000, what I would need to do is I would need to take the top, because basically what did I do to the bottom to get to 1,000? Well, I added 2 zeros, or I multiplied by 100. So on top I would multiply by 100 and I get 500. For the 7/100 to make that 1,000 in the denominator, I would have to multiply that by 10, so I'd get 70. And then the 6, it's already in 1,000. So basically, the reason why, and then we have our 3 and our 20 and our 400 still, but the reason why we call this 423, so that's the first part, and that's where our decimal point is. The reason why we say 576 thousandths is because in order to make all three of these pieces into a fraction with the same denominator, we would have 500, we would have 70, and we would have the 6. So when you put it together, 576 thousandths. Let's look at another example like this. So we have 3.64. We want to write this in expanded form and in words. So expanded form means to separate every little piece. So we have 3 plus, now we get into decimals. So decimals, we're going to separate them as fractions to kind of represent what they really mean. 0.6 is the same thing as saying 6/10 because it's in the tenths place. And the 4 needs to go over 100 because it's in the hundredths place. Again, if I want to convert my my fractions so that they're all they all have the same denominator, I would write it like this: 3 plus, you take the biggest denominator, which is 100, and you take all of the other fractions and you rewrite it like that. So I would need to, in order to make this 10/100, I'd multiply by 10, which means I would have 60 on top. And then the 4 is just going to stay. So basically, when you go to say this, you're going to say 3 and where your decimal is, 64 hundredths, because you have the 60 plus the 4 all over 100. So you just say 64 hundredths. So that's that. Next example is writing these decimals. We're going to write them from largest to smallest. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You can look at them and say, okay, the more zeros they have, the smaller they are, because that means the closer they are to 0. So for example, this 0.006 and the 0.003, those are going to be much smaller because they have more zeros, which means they're closer to 0. But what I would like to do is look at these as fractions and kind of compare them as fractions, just so it's another way of doing so. So let's take each piece and let's rewrite it as a fraction. So this first decimal, 0.03, the 3 is in the hundredths, so that means it's going to be 3/100. 0.3, the 3 is in the tenths place, so it's going to be 3/10. 0.032, the ending number is in the thousandth position, so this is really 32/1000. Then we have 6 is in the thousands place. And 3 is in the thousands place. And 2 is in the tenths place. So now what we're going to look at is, since our biggest denominator is 1,000, we want to convert everything so that it has a denominator of 1,000, because we know when we're comparing fractions, we want to compare them with the same denominators. So any fractions right now that are already have a denominator of 1,000, we can just leave those as is. And everything else we need to convert. So I'm just kind of copying down the ones I already have, and I'm putting all of these so they have a denominator of 1,000. So for this first one here, what did I do to 100 to get to 1,000? Well, I would have to multiply by 10, or multiply by an additional 0, so I'd have 30 up top. What did I do to 100 to get 1,000? Well, I need 2 additional zeros, so that means I multiplied by 100. So up top, 3 times 100, you get 300. Those are all good. Go to the last one. I had to multiply by 100 to go from 10 to 1,000. So you multiply the top by 100, we get 200. Keep in mind to check your work, you could actually cancel some zeros. That's kind of how you can check. So if I look at this first one, if I cancel these zeros, you can see I went back to the original, the 3 over 100. So that's just a way to check. Now that I have all of these decimals with the same denominators, now I can really compare. And remember that we're going from largest to smallest. So in order to be the largest, that really means that you should have the biggest numerator, because you kind of want to think of these numbers as you're dividing it into 1,000 ways. So the biggest numerator, when you divide it by 1,000, is still going to be bigger than if I start with a smaller numerator and I divide by 1,000. So the first one here is going to be this 0.3. So this is going to be our first when I reorder. So 0.3 is going to be the biggest. Then I'm going to go to the 200 over 1,000, because now I have 200 to split 1,000 ways. So it's going to be 0.2. Then I go to the next biggest, which is going to be 32. So that's number 3. So it's going to be 0.032. Then I go to my 30. So that's going to be 0.03. Then I have 6. So 0.006. And lastly, I have 0.003. So these are our 6 decimals in order from largest to smallest. Again, like I said before we even started, you can kind of just look at it by the order of the zeros you have, or the how many zeros you have. So these smaller numbers have a lot more zeros, closer to the decimal, which means they're actually closer to 0. The next example here, we want to write each number as a fraction or a mixed number. So for the first example, if I give you 0.004, to rewrite that as a fraction, which we kind of did in the problem above, just to refresh your memory, is going to be 4 over 1,000, because 4 is in the third decimal position, which means it's 1,000. You can also think of it as 1,000 has 3 zeros, so it's got to be 4 divided by 1,000. What we didn't look at in the previous problem is what happens if you have something with a whole number and a decimal. So 3.64. How do I rewrite this as a fraction? So it's going to be a mixed number. The 3 is going to be the whole number part. And then the 64 has to go over 100 because it's 2 decimal position, which means 2 zeros and 100. It's in the you gotta divide it by 100. If you wanted to write this as an improper fraction, you could leave it as 3 and 64 over 100, or an improper fraction. You're going to multiply these pieces, so it's 300, and then you add the 64. So it's going to be 364 over 100. If you divide 364 by 100, you would get 3.64. So either way, this all kind of works out to end up being, the same thing. It's just different ways of representing it. And then let's look at one last example of this. So we have 25.4936. And if you notice, there's 4 decimal places. So when I go to write this, it's going to be 25 as my whole number. My fraction, since there are 4 decimal places, the number in the bottom has to have 4 zeros. So it's going to be a 10,000 decimal. So 4936 goes on top. So 4,936 thousandths is what I'm representing here as a decimal. We're not going to turn that one into a mixed fraction or mixed number because it's or improper fraction because it's just going to look messy. We'll keep it as a mixed number. One last thing before we're done, and it is rounding. So this one you guys know pretty well, but if we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, hopefully now you'll know, 100 has 2 zeros, so that means 2 decimal places. So I need to look at the third decimal and I need to decide. If it's 5 or bigger, you're going to round up. If it's 4 or smaller, you're going to keep it the same. So if I want to round this to the nearest, let's just make this hundredth, and then I'll talk about 100. So nearest hundredth, 2 decimals. So this would just stay 9,235 and 49 hundredths. Now, what happens if I wanted to round that to the nearest hundred, which is what I originally wanted for this problem? So nearest hundred. So nearest hundred means if you look at this original number, so now I'm just going to use the previous, in the hundreds position is right here at this 2, so I'm still going to use the term to the right, and I'm going to decide, is it bigger than 5, is it 5 or bigger, or is it 4 or smaller? So it's a 3, so that means it's going to stay at 200. I don't have enough to say that it's going to go up to 300. So kind of think of it as 250 or more, you can say, oh, we're going to round it to 300. Less than 250, we got to say, it's just 200. So if I wanted to round this to the nearest 100, it's going to be 9,200. Nearest hundredth, which I changed this up here, means decimal, where nearest 100 means whole number. Okay, so keep that in mind. So then this last one, this is going to be a decimal because we're looking at 10,000. So the nearest 10,000, think about the number 10,000. There's 4 zeros. So that tells me that I need to go 4 decimal places. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm looking at this number here. It's bigger than 5, so that means I need to bump that 4 up to a 5. So when I round, it's going to be 0.035. Okay, so it would be 35 10,000ths. So that's it for that. After this, we'll talk about operations with decimals in the next few lessons.